Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, July 20th, 2020. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'm really excited for you to be here with me today. Thank you so much for joining me, whether you are live or in the archive. On this episode, we are talking about the latest mind-blowing federal spending and deficit numbers from June of this year. And, of course, the Federal Reserve, which is the engine that drives this insane spending and the largest government, most powerful government in the history of the planet. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We've got a bunch of live streaming video platforms. We're on Facebook, YouTube, DLive, Twitch, and Periscope. We also have some archive-only video platforms. It's Library, LBRY.TV, Library.tv, Brighteon.com, BitChute.com, and BitTube.tv. You can also find our audio-only podcast edition, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, and elsewhere. All of those platforms, all of the archives of the show, we've been doing it for about 2 years now. Individual episodes with special show notes. I put links to everything that I cover because I'm really just scratching the surface in each of these episodes, and it really is up to you to read further and learn more and get all the context. You can find all of this information and more over at the show homepage. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And it would be stupid of me not to mention it. You can also find our membership program because we can't get this work done without the financial faith and support of our members. That's also on there. It starts out as little as $2 a month. Anyways, before getting to the details and the nasty, disgusting numbers that are coming out of Washington, D.C. every single month, most recent ones, I want to take a quick look over at the live chat again. I hope you guys all had a great weekend. Hi to Tim Martin. Good to see you, buddy. Bob Landry says the GOP is such a joke. They talk about a good game about government largesse, but love to spend as much as the other side. Yeah, no doubt about it. Tyler B., Justin Bayola, good to see you guys. Alan Hughes, thank you for being here over on Facebook again. Patricia Dance, always good to see you. Bob Brewer down in Tyler, hello. Larry Clark, Gary Townsend, Michael McDonald, Melody Skaman, MRGF 78, Jane, Lawrence Smith, Dan Reed, we have to work, and everybody else, the Chicken Man, and all of you. I appreciate you guys. I see a lot of very familiar names, some personal friends of mine, some longtime supporters, Melissa Harrell, and everyone else. I apologize if I miss anyone. Hi to Greg, that's the last one. I apologize if I missed everyone. And whether you're commenting live or in the archives, I do read through all of them. If you've got ideas for future episodes, you can email me or leave them in the comments, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Last week, I did an episode based solely on an email with an article in it from one of our regular viewers on YouTube. So if you've got ideas or thoughts, things that you want to share, you think I'm an idiot, you think I'm brilliant, I don't care. Share your thoughts because it gives me so many ideas of stuff to cover in the future. Anyways, let's get to this. And I want to start out with this article we published over the weekend. It was actually on, I guess, Saturday from Mike Meharry. It's a general overview of one of the biggest problems that we face today. That is the Federal Reserve. I will link to this in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I've got 3 segments I'm going to highlight through this episode today, but there's more to read and there's some links for more stuff to read in that as well. And here's how Mike starts it out. He says, over the last few years, sound money, we're talking about gold, silver, even using cryptocurrency, anything outside of the Federal Reserve System, has become one of the 10th Amendment Center's primary policy areas. In fact, I think it is first. It is the first one listed. Now, not that first is always the most important, but it might be first or right near the top of our annual State of the Nullification Movement report in the second half where we cover how things are going. Mike writes, the objective, create an environment for currency competition that can potentially undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. The only thing I would add is the unconstitutional Federal Reserve's unconstitutional monopoly on money. Why? He says, because the Fed is the engine that drives the most powerful government in the history of the world. And I have been saying that a lot lately, and I was actually able to go to the gym in my apartment building last week before they reclosed it. And I was thinking about this. Am I just spouting off? Am I just thinking something that I remember reading some time ago? Because I keep calling this government that we live under the most powerful, the largest in history. And so I started looking into it. I'm like, who else could be worse? And at least today, maybe it could be China, because they've got what, like 3 times the population, and they're a socialist system. It says in their own constitution that it is a socialist dictatorship of the people, or something like that it says. You guys could pull that up and correct me if I've got the verbiage not exactly correct. But they're 3 times the size of the US. We're supposed to think that China is a very dangerous threat to the US. They're commies, right? Well, let's compare how they're spending. It's insane here. This is from 2017 and 2019, maybe 2016. The list that I'm citing here comes from the CIA World Factbook. And expenditures for the US is $6.8 trillion. China was 3.7. It's not double, but the US is significantly larger in the amount of spending that it does than even the Chi-Coms, than the communist Chinese government. It's not even close, actually, especially considering the fact that they have so many additional people. And I think that's important context to have, because if we're in the land of the free, these numbers should be flipped. And in fact, the United States government, I've got this pulled up on the screen for those of you who are watching. I apologize to those of you who are just listening on the podcast, but you can go, and I will link to this in the show notes so you can see it. But the U.S. should not be in the top 10 as far as spending, because we know, as James Madison told us in Federalist 45, that under the Constitution, the federal government's powers would be, in his words, few and defined. Those reserved to the states, and the people of the several states are numerous and indefinite. So most of what the federal government shouldn't exist. Let's say we cut it back by 50%. 50% would drop the U.S. easily out of number 1 and put it to at least number 2, still higher than Japan, Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, all these highly socialist systems that the U.S. is worse than. And supposedly we're hearing from one side of the political aisle that they're out there trying to stop socialism, but they are part of that problem. And in fact, they may be even a worse part of the problem when they're in power, because they don't act like an opposition like they do when the other side is in power. That might deserve its own episode. So then I also looked at, as I was looking through the statistics, you can actually look at the budget spending per capita. The worst in the world, or the most spending, government spending. I call that the worst in the world, because when government spends stuff, they're actually stealing from people in the first place. Maybe other countries, I don't want to butt into their business, and I think that's how we should have both economic and foreign policy. We shouldn't butt into their business, but my general opinion is that government is bad. Government doesn't do good stuff in almost every situation, and when it does, and let's say it's like a broken clock, what it does, it generally overpromises, underdelivers, or it costs 10 times as much as what they told us it would cost in the first place. So even if they do accomplish something, so let's say they want to go out and buy a Honda Civic. Well, if they pay $250,000 for that Honda Civic, someone might tout it as a success. Yeah, we bought the Honda Civic, but it costs that much. And I got that argument a few years ago. I heard Mark Edge over at Free Talk Live, which is a show that I haven't listened to in a while, but I used to listen to pretty religiously. Might be interesting to pick that one up again as well. Free Talk Live with Ian Freeman and Mark and a number of other people. I'm not sure who the hosts are these days. But anyways, if you spend that much money, it isn't a success. Anyway, so Luxembourg is the worst. But let's compare the U.S. and China. What was the U.S. I don't know what their ranking is, but they're like in the top 20. U.S. government is like top 20, and China, if you scroll way down, it's 20,000 billions. What is that? I don't know what the conversion is, but it's like 7.5 times the amount of China. So it's really, really pretty nasty. Let me see what I put in my notes here. Looks like about 7 times down. Anyways, let's get to the latest numbers. The latest numbers, again, we published this just last week, the June deficit, just for the month of June, the amount of money they take in versus the amount of money that they're spending. So we seriously have a spending problem. There are too many programs that shouldn't exist, and they keep spending. When they get less revenue, they should cut back on the programs, but they don't. The June deficit, Mike Meharry writes, came in at $864.1 billion. And we hear these billions of dollars being spent and borrowed and trillion-dollar bailout programs all the time, that we almost become numb to it. They're mind-blowing, but mind-numbing at the same time. The numbers are so large that they cannot be repaid. It's not possible. But just for the month of June, came in at $864 billion. That's according to the latest Treasury Department report. And Mike writes, to put that into perspective, here are the biggest annual budget deficits in U.S. history. So the largest annual budgets in U.S. history. Number one was 2009, a combination of the previous two administrations, $1.4 trillion. That's the largest in history for a full year. Number two, 2011. You're going to notice a pattern here where most of the top ones come. 2009, number two is 2011, 1.3 trillion. Number three is 2010, 1.3 trillion. Number four is 2012, 1.1 trillion. I'm rounding up here. So the top four are all from the previous administration and a little bit from the guy before that, the warmonger before that. They're all warmongers, really. Number five is 2019, just under $1 trillion, $984 billion. So to put this in perspective, the top five largest budget deficits in U.S. history forever have been somewhere between 1 and 1.5 trillion. Yet the budget deficit just for the month of June in 2020 was $864 billion. It is literally the amount in 1 month to equal worse than every president in history for an entire year, except one person. Well, we'll say 1.5. This is absolutely terrible. And it's another reason, to me, it's reason number 800,393. If I got that number, 394. That tells me voting for one team over the other to supposedly shrink the size of government never works. There's always something that comes up, and they always have an excuse as to why government continues growing. It doesn't even grow at the same pace. It just keeps going up and up and up. And what do you think the next guy's going to do, or the next woman is going to do? The next person coming into office is going to look at this as a floor, not a ceiling, and always grow the size of government. Now, here from the CBO, they put an estimate out of what they expect to be the yearly. Oh, I want to cover a little bit more from Mike. He actually says, well, I can mention the CBO. They actually they project this year's, the 2020 budget deficit to be $3.7 trillion. The worst ever was in 2009 at 1.4. This is going to be more than double the worst in history. It couldn't be more bad. Absolutely awful and dangerous. And this is not going to play out well in the long run. Whether it's going to be us or some future generation is going to feel a lot of hurt. And I've got a nice quote from Thomas Jefferson when I close out this episode to hammer that home. Here's how Meharry puts it, though. He says, it's hard to even come up with words to describe a monthly budget shortfall of $864 billion. For the fiscal year of 2020, that starts in October, so October of last year, the administration has spent $2.74 trillion more than it has taken in already. The previous record deficit for an entire year was $1.4 trillion, set in 2009. Now, we know what was going on at that time. It was another crisis, the Great Recession. So each crisis causes worse and worse situations because people, of course, fear, as we know, is the foundation of most, if not all, governments. John Adams in 1776 said it was the foundation of most governments. For me, it's the foundation of all governments. And people are afraid, so then they're willing to turn a blind eye. And I think there's also a serious problem with factions. I covered that in an episode about a week or so ago. Factions and partisanship, so people who would generally be screaming from the rooftops how bad this spending was, from 2009 to 2012 are suddenly turning a blind eye. I noticed one senator down in Texas suddenly put out a video this week talking about how both parties are really bad on spending and it's dangerous. Well, he must be seeing the writing on the wall and suddenly wanting to sound like a fiscal conservative again, but it's utter garbage. It's an utter lie. It's posturing. These people really aren't on board with this stuff when their team is in charge. Mike goes on. He says, despite Keynesian claims, I like that he puts that, Keynesian claims that the spending was necessary to stimulate the economy in the midst of the Great Recession. The at the time historic deficit set off a right-wing firestorm and birthed the Tea Party movement. Remember that? There was this whole movement, taxed enough already. I mean, in and of itself, the idea of taxed enough already is bad. They're basically saying all the taxes that we have now are okay. This is enough. But the fact of the matter is, almost all of it, all the spending needs to be cut and gotten rid of as well. You don't need all the taxes. You don't need all the money printing. You don't need all the spending if you don't have the federal programs that shouldn't exist. But what empowers that? What enables it? Of course, it's the Fed. He says, with the other team now sitting in the Oval Office today and spending magnitudes higher, and it is magnitudes high. If we're talking about double the worst in history is likely to happen, if not worse than double, it's probably going to be worse than that, close to triple. Spending magnitudes higher. What have we heard? Basically crickets. I'm starting to hear a little bit, and I think they're concerned for their political standing going forward. They have to look good when the other team is in power in a future time. And Mike puts it this way. We're talking again about the Federal Reserve to another article. I'm shifting back and forth between an article that he wrote over the weekend and a blog that we published last week. And Mike does great work on economics. He's been the one of the lead guys over at Shift Gold for quite a while. He does a weekly podcast on Fridays that I encourage you to check out as well. I think it's called the Weekly Gold Wrap Podcast. If I get it wrong, I'm sorry, Mike. Anyways, he puts it this way. You simply cannot grasp the economic big picture without understanding how the Federal Reserve and its monetary policies drive the boom-bust cycle. I've got an episode on this that I did about a year ago. I don't have the link to it handy, but I'll try to include it in the show notes, basically explaining how the Federal Reserve drives this whole system. It isn't the free market. It isn't capitalism. It isn't that stuff. We don't need more government intervention. We need less all around. Mike continues. He says the effects of all other government policies work within the Fed's monetary framework. Money printing and interest rate manipulations, when they're always like, they come out with a meeting and they're like, well, we're going to lower it to this, or we're going to raise it a quarter point or a couple of basis points. This is the Federal Reserve dictating what interest should be to everyone. So it is not a free market. This is a Chinese socialist system. Even if it's not in name, it acts like it. Money printing and interest rate manipulations fuel booms, Mike writes, and the inevitable attempt to return to normalcy precipitates busts. What you really need is a correction, a very painful correction. And that's the unfortunate truth. That's what the Great Depression was. That was the recession. The Great Recession was a correction, but the Federal Reserve immediately, I think it went from like a 5% federal funds rate down to like 1.25% or something like that in a period of just a few months. Between late 2008 and early 2009. Something, I may have the dates and the exact numbers, but it was around that. Now they don't have that much ammo left because they've been hovering around zero for so long. They can only go to negative if they really want to stimulate the economy, or they just print more and more money. They hand it out to the rich people who already have it, the investment bankers, the commercial banks, and they get to spend it before that money trickles down through the economy. It's a trickle-down ripoff. And what happens is, as more money gets into the economy, the inflation isn't really the prices going up. It is more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. It's the increase in the amount of dollars that causes our egg prices to go from 99 cents for a dozen to $2.99. I'm starting to see things when I go to a Whole Foods market for just organic eggs, $6, $7, $8 for a dozen eggs. And not to just sound like an old man about this, but the reason it isn't 99 cents anymore is the Federal Reserve. It's not like, oh, the good old days. It's really just the Federal Reserve is destroying that. Mike puts it this way. In simplest terms, easy money blows up bubbles. Bubbles pop and set off a crisis. Rinse, wash, repeat. I think it should be wash, rinse, repeat. But we get the idea here. And going further in that article, this is a great summary. He says, money is power. And the Federal Reserve serves as an unlimited spigot pumping dollars into the economy. They couldn't spend this kind of money. And it wouldn't be the Federal Reserve working with the Treasury Department, figuring out how to get stimulus checks, bailouts to people and businesses and other organizations. This printing is just nuts. It monetizes the federal debt and enables a level of borrowing, Mike writes, that wouldn't be possible otherwise. Without the Federal Reserve, they couldn't do this because they'd run out of cash. Without the Fed, he said, there would be no foreign wars. There would be no massive, unsustainable social programs. There would be no police state. There would be no corporate welfare programs. The federal government would truly be limited. And when people talk about defund the police, if you don't actually include like ending a government organization within the Fed, in the long run, you're going to miss out. Not to say that I don't want to shut down government agencies. I want almost all of them gone because they're all enforcing or carrying out unconstitutional federal laws, acts, regulatory programs. On the state level, too, so many unconstitutional within the state constitution are all being enforced, too. So, but if you don't think about the engine that drives this, creating a new organization out of a vacuum, we're going to run into a lot of problems in the long run. If you don't strike the root, if you only hack at the branches, new branches grow in. And Mike puts it this way: if you want to end unconstitutional, overreaching federal power, end the Fed. And I would also say if you want to end unconstitutional, overreaching state power, whether it's the narrow areas within the federal constitution that states can violate or the broad areas in the state constitutions, because most state programs that are really bad, whether it's surveillance or whatever it may be, they're often funded or encouraged by the federal government in the first place. So everyone's acting like these states aren't acting like sovereign states, sovereignty of the people of each of the states. They're acting like oversized counties of a federal national blob that never should have existed in the first place. And I think, just like I was mentioning before, I wanted to cover this quote from Thomas Jefferson. This was a letter to his great protege, John Taylor of Caroline, May 28th, 1816, if my notes are correct. And this is just a timeless one. Jefferson put it this way: the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. I should say it one more time. The principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. It is a total, massive, multi-generational ripoff when they borrow and spend, borrow and spend. And if you don't think you're going to get affected by it, your children, your grandchildren, their children, on and on. The piper will be asking for it, whether it comes in the form of an economic collapse or something else, a complete totalitarian crackdown. It's going to be something, and it's not going to be good. Anyways, I want to take a look over in the live chat, see what's going on. I'll keep this Jefferson quote up on the screen. Greg McCauley said the Federal Reserve failed to act and provide the cash needed for banks to handle the runs. This created more runs. I'm not sure. Oh, you guys might be talking about the 1920s. Keynes was wrong, says Erwin Havranek. Absolutely. Taking a look, Erwin also said Friedman is right about the Fed. I'm not familiar with what Milton Friedman had to say about the Federal Reserve. I know it just shouldn't exist. Under the Constitution, it shouldn't exist. Thomas Jefferson made a strong argument against any type of national bank in his famous opinion against the constitutionality of the national bank in February of 1791. Even before the Bill of Rights was ever ratified, he specifically said, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, I consider the Constitution based under this foundation. That is, and he read off what ended up being the text of the 10th Amendment. And he said there is no power delegated in the federal government's Constitution, in the Constitution for the federal government for the United States, that allows it, that authorizes it to charter a bank or any other type of corporation for that matter. Neil says, bring back the gold standard is going to take, and I'm going to cover this. Mike's going to do a follow-up. He's actually going to do an overview over the next couple of months, maybe every 1 to 2 weeks, an overview of each of the primary policy areas where we're working to nullify, undermine, resist, and defeat federal programs. And sometime over the next few weeks, I think, if that's going to be his next one, it's just up to him. A follow-up on this Federal Reserve Engine article that he did over the weekend, talking about how we're taking action on a state or a local level to actually implement policies that create this monetary competition to undermine, to expand the use of gold and silver as it should be, which is money. So we've got some interesting stuff over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. But when Mike does that article, I'll do an episode covering that as well. We'll also be covering things like the surveillance state, gun control, national health care, and things like that. Basically rejecting unconstitutional federal programs. Going further, Brian Cox said, didn't Greenspan say deficit spending is merely a scheme for the hidden confiscation of wealth. Maybe if he did, he's merely reiterating the type, and if he is, he's absolutely correct. And that's Brian over on Facebook. Absolutely correct. And in fact, in these series of letters between Jefferson and John Taylor, Taylor was talking about in response, not to this particular letter, I believe, in 1816, but sometime in this time frame when they were talking about monetary policy and banks, and Jefferson actually, as a precursor to that one where he says the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity, he actually pointed out that he thinks banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies. And because of this, because they enable this. And a banking institution, a central banking institution, is the most dangerous of them all. But John Taylor at some point was recognizing that, of course, a lot of the spending was going to national defense. And his statement to Jefferson was national defense is the usual policy or a pretext for fleecing the people. Fleecing the people and national defense was how Taylor put it. The rest of it is just a paraphrase, but that's a pretty important point. And Greg McCauley says central banks have been a debate since 1800. Absolutely. I don't think there is any debate. They have been destroying the economy. They've been destroying purchasing power. They've been manipulating. They've been turned what should be a free market into a centralized command and control system and have enabled so much of the unconstitutional, so many of the unconstitutional programs we see around us, whether it's foreign policy or domestic. Anyways, I'll read through the rest of these comments a little bit later today. I'll reply to as many as I can, so please continue leaving your thoughts and your feedback, whether it's in the live stream comments or later on in the archives. If you do support the show, if you thought this was at least interesting, I hope you found it interesting and educational. Make sure to smash the like button. It's free, easy, takes a second. You can also subscribe. On YouTube, you can get bell notifications. On iTunes, you can help us out by leaving a review. Every time someone leaves a review on iTunes, it basically tells the platform like, oh, people are interested in the show, and you should show, the algorithm should show the program to more people. So as we've been getting more and more of those coming in on a steady basis, I can't thank you enough. And if you would consider doing that as well, I'd really appreciate that. And of course, if you really want to support us and kick in financially, do not feel pressure to do this, but if you're able to afford it, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. That's where you can sign up. If you're already a member and you want to add an extra donation, I never want to say no. Or if you don't want to sign up for something, you can go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Enough of the promotional stuff. I can't thank you enough for spending some time with me today. I hope you had a great weekend. Your Monday is off to a good start. Yeah, I hope you learned something. I hope this was a good episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.